Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me now. Let me know if you can hear me now. Am I audible? Am I audible? Am I audible or am I silent? Can you hear me? So if you can hear me, we're going to be good. And if you can't, we're not going to be good. So let's give this a whirl. Yes, no, no, yes, yes, no, yes, no, yes, 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 yes. Beautiful community. Let's ground ourselves a little bit in how the war is going with this chat. This is only the third time in about 6 weeks, third or fourth, that I've been in this chair. So this is very vertical for me indeed. So I'm going to do my best. Despite the health challenge, I actually had an interesting thought today when I was looking through Twitter, kind of educational thought, where I banned myself from responding to negative comments today because I felt that with my physical symptoms, I couldn't calibrate my responses properly to be constructive enough. Now, that doesn't mean that I'd be terribly mean to people who are being bad on Twitter. It would just mean that um, unless I feel I can be truly intentional, right, in modulating something like my constructive aggression, for example, I'm not gonna respond. I'm not gonna engage. I think it's obviously an exaggerated situation for me because I'm doing it out of physical symptoms that I'm suffering, but it's generally a healthy balance to strike, right? Am I in the right place to even be interacting on this platform? And if I felt that there could be a chance of me being 10% more mean to somebody, perhaps, or a chance of me not seeing the and emphasizing the big picture, the constructive way. I thought, no, I'm not going to interact. So I just think that's actually a universal lesson for all of us. And what's the lesson? Don't try to make good coffee when you don't have the facilities to do it. Just do something else, make a cup of tea. So I think when it comes to thinking about what on earth is happening with the war, there are at least 3 questions, right? The first question is, where is it actually going? The second question is, where should it be going relative to our capacity in the West, right? If we ask this question from the point of view of us, right, who are concerned about the West's interests in Ukraine's fight for its freedom. And the third question is, what could we be doing? Where would the war be going if we had capacities that we don't have? If our democracies were resplendently secure, if we had a lot of bipartisan capacity for agreement on foreign policy issues, right? So where could it go if we were in a world that we're not in? Where can it go? Where should we try to make it go in a way that's realistic to our capacities? And where is it actually going? And I think that the most imaginatively stimulating question in a way to discuss is, where would this be going if the West were strong the way it isn't? One of the hardest questions to talk about is, what should the West be doing relative to its capacities? And that's a really difficult question to talk about because the West itself has not articulated this, right? The West is supporting Ukraine without a clear articulation of where it wants this to land, right? And then there is the less difficult but very unpredictable question of where things are actually going. So that three-way distinction is helpful. And then, of course, there is another distinction that's helpful, and that is between a worst case scenario for Ukraine and a best case scenario for Ukraine and everything in between. And what do we see these two poles as looking like, roughly? What would it be for the best conceivable outcome to materialize for Ukraine? What would it be for the worst conceivable outcome to materialize for Ukraine? What should we think of as sufficiently within the bounds of reality, um, as options to consider for realistic worst and realistic best case scenarios? Let's run a little poll, which we tried last time, and I'm going to say who is winning, and I put winning in quote marks. For the moment, and let's have our answers be Ukraine, Russia, West, and hard to know. Let's start this poll. And of course, winning is something that has to be put thrice in quote marks, because what winning really means for the purpose of this question is relative to what the West can realistically do about this. How is it going? Basically, that's the question. And I think most of you are going to tend to hard to know. So let's picture a worst and a best case scenario very, very briefly. I don't know what I'm going to say even when I talk about these, and then we'll interact and take some questions. So a worst case scenario is fairly obvious, right? A worst case scenario is that Russia gains political control over Ukraine. It doesn't mean occupation of Ukraine, but that Russia gains political control over Ukraine over the next 10 years, such that we can say that Ukraine has lost its sovereignty. That's the worst case scenario. That means that Ukraine might be economically unviable given how much territory it's lost. It means that Ukraine has not received any security guarantees from the West. It means that Ukraine has not been allowed to enter any Western alliances. And it also means that Ukraine has been forced into accepting restrictions on its military capacity as part of some kind of a deal that preclude it from being able to defend itself while also not having any guarantees to be protected by the West. That's really the worst case scenario. The best case scenario from Ukraine's point of view is obviously full territorial liberation, economic viability, and a capacity to enter Western alliances as it pleases, and via whatever mechanism it might be, full security that it won't be invaded by Russia trying to invade it again. We have to broaden this, though, because Russia poses a global and regional threat. So presumably, a best case scenario will also mean that somehow there's a pretty good guarantee that Russia ain't going to invade anybody else or isn't going to try anything else on such a scale in the short and medium term future. So what does that mean? Does that mean the collapse of the Putin regime? But couldn't something else take its place that'll threaten us too? Does that mean some kind of more fundamental change in Russia? What is that change? federalization, collapse territorially, some kind of democratization? What are we talking about? And that, I think, in itself is telling, because it's striking how fast we run aground when we try to imagine best case scenarios, because we haven't had any public discourse about them, because we have been engaged on a kind of ad hoc basis. We'll support Ukraine in this and that way a little bit more, and that's it. Well, what if we try to bridge these poles, right? What what are the more realistic or the more likely best and worst case scenarios, right? Let me say one thing here very clearly. What Ukraine cannot do is acknowledge any of its territories as belonging to Russia as part of any deal. That's impossible. Not impossible because it's morally wrong, because Donbass and Crimea are Ukrainian, blah, 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 because it's politically impossible. That's to say that no government could retain power in Ukraine. There could be no political stability in Ukraine if any of its governments acknowledged Ukrainian territory to be Russian. So the only mode of territorial concession available to Ukraine that's compatible with political stability is to acknowledge that Russia controls its territory, but not to acknowledge that it's Russian territory. To acknowledge that Ukraine will not attempt to regain its own territory by military means without acknowledging that it's no longer Ukraine's territory, right? So Ukraine's only option in territorial concession that's compatible with political stability at home is to say, this is ours, but we agree that we will not try to militarily regain it, but it's ours. We're not saying that it's Russia now. We refuse to recognize the legitimacy of Russia's claims to it, but we accept the reality that this will be part of Russia in the sense that we will not try to territorially require it, though we may try to require it by other means. We may try to require it by political means under conditions of regime change in Russia. So if Ukraine is losing territory as part of any kind of deal, that's the only mode that could possibly even be a palatable starter for it, because you simply cannot be a Ukrainian government and then acknowledge Ukrainian territory as Russian. A Kremlin problem is that it's very hard to see how a stable Putin regime will be open to Ukraine joining NATO in any constituency. That's to say that Russia gets to keep territory that it has, for instance, but the rest of Ukraine joins NATO. Well, Putin cannot agree to that from a position of strength. That's fundamentally unacceptable to a Putin regime that's still stable. And so this is the beginning of a conversation that will go on for a long time if we have it. And the components of it are roughly going to be, what's the territorial deal? That's to say, who gets what territory? Secondly, what's the status of Ukraine? What alliances can it join? And thirdly, what security guarantees does Ukraine have? And if it's not NATO security guarantees, what other security guarantees from some Western coalition of the willing is it going to have? So security guarantees, the status of Ukraine, and the territorial question are going to be what's on the table. And when Trump, because he's a fake, contentless populist, talks about doing a deal, his deal will inevitably run into needing to have some kind of answer that's viable on both sides to these three questions under particular circumstances that obtain whenever Trump might try it. Kamala Harris will need to reckon with these three factors if she wants, as she would want, to bring the war to a close as soon as there is a sustainable close available for Ukraine. So nothing that I've said is definitive or constructive. And I think I do owe you a short and sharp how the war ends video on the main channel. Um, just to give a more concentrated picture of on this when I'm a bit more articulate than I am now. But I think that's some of the beginning of that conversation. So how does that sound? How does what I've said sound to you? Thank you, Peter. How does what I've said sound to you? And do you have any questions that we can kick off with? Mark is asking the age-old question of why the Russian people are going along with Putin and his demands for war, death, and division. We have got a profoundly depoliticized population that is outsourcing politics to Putin that can only change when they have a perception of an available alternative toward which they can practically act and make a difference. And that's only going to happen as if there is a very big crack in the Kremlin. And if there is some leadership from the Russian opposition, by which I don't mean the liberal opposition, I mean some kind of opposition that arises, that offers a vision. So you need some kind of leadership, some kind of vision, and a big crack in the regime for the population to get a perception of there being an actionable alternative. Only then do you actually wake up a radically, radically, deeply depoliticized, consumerist population that is committed to private freedoms, but is trying to run away from having to think at all about public freedoms. So that's an answer in a nutshell. Marty Crow is saying for Ukraine to win, Russia would have to collapse. Well, the trouble is that I don't consider Russian collapse a Ukrainian victory because it could happen in 27 years. And I don't think that's a victory for Ukraine, getting some kind of outcome 27 years from now or 17 years from now, right? So I think that if we're talking about a middle distance collapse of the Putin regime, there are first of all questions about what that's going to look like anyway. What's it going to lead to anyway? But then I think that is too removed from where we are today for that to be put into the sort of victory box in terms of how we might think of the war now. Susanna is saying, is a marginal loss by Trump a comparatively convenient scenario for Russia in terms of probability of sparking a major US social unrest? So when Putin says he backs Kamala Harris, he is not lying. He's just doing political technology with speech. He's just saying, what words can I put together that are effective for me, for a local or a global audience? He doesn't mean that he prefers Trump to win very clearly on balance. But there is a part of him that fancies himself no matter what happens in the West, because he thinks that what America is really doing now, and here I somewhat agree with his analysis, is managing decline and withdrawal from the world. And he thinks that it'll be more advantageously managed from Russia's point of view if Trump's in power. In other words, it'll be more destructively managed for America. And if Kamala Harris is in power, Putin thinks that decline will be better managed, but decline it still will be. Now, on the specific question of marginal victories either way, yes, we're genuinely looking at a possibility of a democratic and constitutional crisis. with unrest in the United States, almost whatever happens with this election. And there's no doubt that the Russians are going to like it, the worse it is. But to answer your question directly, no, he would prefer a Trump victory to a marginal Trump loss. Partly because he thinks that all the most likely scenarios under Trump are advantageous for him. He thinks there are some extreme scenarios under Trump that could work against him. But he thinks the most likely scenarios under Trump are going to favor him. So he prefers Trump. But if we just, and so therefore a Trump victory is better than a marginal Trump loss. But he'd prefer a marginal Kamala Harris victory relative to a big Kamala Harris victory. That would be one way of answering your question, I think. Eric is asking, what is Russia's strategy? Russia's strategy is our decline. Russia's strategy is that you're going to have lots of Trumps and Orbans and Le Pens in power in different Western countries. And then Russia's aggressive projection of power in Ukraine or elsewhere will be something that it can make deals around and get away with. Up to a point, and this is something we may discuss again in a more constructive way on the main channel soon, I hope, even up to potentially challenging Article 5. And I know experts disagree about whether Russia would ever be interested in challenging Article 5. Do I think I could get Tim Snyder or Stephen Kotkin for a chat? I think so. The conversation format is something I've never done before on the main channel, with a couple of exceptions, I think, which were just friendly chats. But I am exploring potentially a conversational format from time to time on the main channel. So watch this space, please. There may be something exciting coming soon. Max is asking, what's Ukraine's best chance for a good outcome now? Maybe the best argument that Ukraine has toward the West in favor of increasing support. Ukraine's outcome is predicated on the sustenance of Western support. That's absolutely the overwhelming driving factor. And that's an extremely precarious. Curtis, thank you for good health wishes. I know I'm a bit less articulate than usual at the moment because I'm dealing with lots of physical stuff, but I'm doing my best. So apologize if I go in circles a bit. But Max, I think Western support for Ukraine is the central story, right? And that's very difficult for Ukraine because it's got to make contingency plans for that support continuing or for that support drying up. And partly the Kursk invasion is a form of hedging around these uncertainties and possibilities. So then we might ask a question, well, what's Ukraine's best realistic outcome relative to Western support carrying on at a kind of middling level? That's to say, no worse and no better than an average analyst might expect it to. And here we're inevitably talking about very significant territorial concessions to Russia without acknowledging that this territory is Russian. And then security guarantees of some kind that are beyond just the strengthening up of Ukraine's military. Um, and the problem is that so far there has been no articulation of any possible security guarantees in public from Western powers. So Ukraine is really in a no man's, no woman's land with that, even though it needs it. That's a very difficult situation in which to be, because without some clarity about security guarantees, Ukraine doesn't even have a negotiating position. It doesn't have enough clarity to negotiate um, because it's only if it has a sense of what the security guarantees that it might get are um, that it could engage in negotiations that are going to be politically acceptable at home. Vlad, would you travel for a podcast appearance? Absolutely. Given my health, that would probably be impossible between now and Christmas, but hopefully in 2025 I would. Um, in the last year, I have declined all invitations in public for health reasons, especially all invitations involving travel. The last time I traveled to do a talk, I think that was in the Czech Republic in 2019 or so, something like that. Um, so it's been a while, but I'm absolutely open in principle. Yes. So it's purely a matter of how my health is going at the time. Andy's asking, what are my thoughts on how these deep drone strikes into Russia and the whole scale destruction of the ammunition warehouse will affect Russian morale and the ability to prosecute the war? It won't affect Russian morale. It won't affect Russian morale. How far it'll affect Russia's ability to prosecute the war, in part, depends on something that's outside of my range of expertise, which is what got destroyed. And here, experts are warning us to be conservative at the moment, not jump to premature conclusions that might be unduly optimistic about just how much stuff got destroyed. But it's a question that the Russians would put into an equation. Well, yes, we're suffering losses in this dimension, but we're doing enormous damage to Ukraine's energy system over the winter months, for instance. And the Russians may think they're doing more damage than they are incurring on balance. In fact, they do think that. Um, so, so there is no, and they're right about that as well. So that's not a problem of morale for the Russians. What I'd say is it's very important to not underestimate Ukraine's capacity to act effectively and innovatively. So I think there are certain kinds of defeatism about Ukraine's capabilities that are floating around that I would warn against. I would also warn against kind of panacea thoughts. If only Ukraine gets X or does Y, gets X weaponry from the West, then it'll be a turning point. At the moment, there is no single thing that we can point to that would be a turning point. This is an accumulative conversation of advantages and disadvantages, and also this is why your question is important, and it's about perception. Um, are both parties still in a place where they think that over time their position could get more advantageous? And I would make the case that at the moment both parties are thinking that. I think at the moment, quite certainly the Russians are thinking that the longer this goes, the better it is for them. And I believe the Ukrainian side is having some such thoughts as well. For instance, looking ahead to um, Russians running into certain equipment shortages in 2026. So there are at least some rational reasons for both sides to think that they can gain further advantage over time, which is why all of these scenarios that I started painting at the beginning are still very elusive, because neither side is really in a position where it's willing to negotiate or even able to negotiate in Ukraine's case. Do I think the West is holding back on long-range weapons out of fear of Ukraine going after the Russian authorities? So I think that there is some room for reasonable optimism about further disinhibition around Ukraine's use of Western weapons, despite the um, current slowdown of this conversation. I think that's a more optimistic conversation than the conversation about some coalition of the willing intercepting Russian weapons over Ukraine. I believe one of the short term concerns the West has about Ukraine being able to take on military targets deeper into Russia with Western weapons is Russian non-nuclear escalation in different parts of the world, right? Russia arming and facilitating um, actors who are the West enemies in different parts of the world. Number one. Number two, um, it's clearly a concern for the Biden administration not to have too much Ukraine war derived turbulence before the election. You could argue that this might make it easier for a Harris administration to engage in this disinhibition, or for a Biden administration to do that too, if Kamala Harris wins the election in November. Andy, thank you so much for best health wishes. Um, doing my best today, and so grateful for everybody tolerating what is to some extent word salad coming out of my mouth, but I'm trying to make sense as best I can. Thomas is saying I voted for Ukraine winning in the poll because I think that it's a win for Ukraine to hold the Russians back even with losses. And that's a strong argument that Ukraine has already achieved a very significant win, namely that it has created a very, very big distance between the current reality and the terrible prospect of Ukraine losing its sovereignty. We're in a very long road away from that. The distance is very big. Now, it could happen because bad things happen in the world that don't look like they're going to happen sometimes. But Ukraine has, in a very powerful way, sustained its sovereignty, which a lot of people felt it wouldn't be able to do. That, of course, is an extraordinary win. But the trouble is that can't be sold as a story of victory seriously. That's sufficient, because very key questions arise for Ukraine's future security, for Ukraine's economic viability, that need answers, right? So that's an enormous win, but it's not a sufficient win to come out well from this brutal invasion by its neighbor. Skywalker is saying if Russia challenged Article 5, there would cease to be a nation state. Well, that's a debate you're having with the tyrant in the Kremlin. The tyrant in the Kremlin, and please understand that I'm not telling you a matter of fact. Nobody knows for sure. But in my interpretation of what's going on in the Kremlin, they believe they could do that when the West is sufficiently weak and that the United States would not defend the Baltic state. So that's a debate you're having about historical interpretation with your opponent, your enemy, the Kremlin tyrant. I find myself agreeing with this bubble consistently on YouTube. Why does John Mearsheimer have different views in this war? Ooh, lost a comment. I lost your comment, but I have in my head some ideas for the main channel, and one of them would be a more philosophical breakdown of what I regard as Mearsheimer's mistakes. That hasn't happened yet, right? Because Mearsheimer talks in his bubble, and people in bubbles like ours often just mock him back. But I think it'd be interesting to talk more about what's actually gone wrong there. And I will do that, health allowing. I do think that this question of bubbles is very important, because one of the risks of us being, and I tweeted this earlier, one of the risks of us being in a pro-Ukraine bubble, which is where we are, isn't that we could be wrong. Read my lips, we're not wrong, right? We're not the bad guys here. Ukraine's not the bad guys here. Putin is the bad guy. This is clear as daylight. So that's not what we couldn't be wrong about that. But being too much in our bubble in a rather narcissistic and self-obsessed way, not looking out sufficiently, might make us be bad at being the good guys. You see what I mean? There's good guys, and there is good guys who are effective, right? So there's a risk for this bubble always, and you know how I always, in other words, various approaches that I use, warn us about that. There's always a risk of us, for instance, over-investing in self-congratulatory moral response to surfaces of what happens, rather than engaging with concrete political realities and how to change those. So talking about being in the bubble and questioning the bubble you're in is really important, even if your bubble's right on the key issue. Naturally, lots of people hyperventilated when they said that on Twitter, which is just unfortunately an illustration of our bubbleness. Good night, good night. Stephen is saying Ukraine is not Russia's Vietnam. There's neither the backlash among the Russian population that there was to Vietnam, nor is the war in Ukraine theoretically unwinnable like the Vietnam War was. This war will be constitutively linked to the inevitable collapse of Putin's political project. So, looking at it from that point of view, it's self-immolating for Russia, actually. Certainly self-immolating for Russia's current political formation. But again, that takes us back to when's the regime going to collapse? And that's, it's not a victory for Ukraine if the Putin project collapses in 2039. JD is saying, do I cover the Middle East? Happy to answer any Middle Eastern question. I did cover the Gaza Israel crisis in October, November 2023. There's about 8, perhaps 7, 8, 9 videos on the chat channel about this. So I find that important. It was important for me to do that, even though I can tell you that for anybody in this bubble, it's a quite algorithmically self-destructive thing to do. But I owed my community a clear statement and a clear moral guidance on it. And the point of moral guidance isn't that it gets adopted. It's rather that it gets conveyed and is something that people can push off from toward agreeing with me, can push off from toward disagreeing with me. But sometimes one thing that a tiny public intellectual like me has a responsibility to do is to give a moral guidance, not in the current moralized, divisive political discourse sense, which is either you're like this or you're bad, but in the sense of this is how I morally weigh something. And then I gave a little bit of an analysis of how I see the Israeli Palestinian conflict as well. Struth is saying you're just like you're generating algorithmic statements without addressing anything. Um, well, I'm I'm perhaps going in circles more than usual in this chat. Um, but no, I think I am exceptionally beautiful as a YouTube platform. I think I offer um, something quite rare. So I disagree. And by saying this nice thing about me, I'm not saying that it's so nice what I share because I'm right. That's very secondary. And one of the things that I'm very grateful for from a lot of the people in this space with me right now is that they're grateful for interactions they've had with me or with my content, more polished stuff on the main channel or here, in a way that's beyond just, oh yeah, that's a good analysis. Now I agree, and it helps me make sense of the world. It, it's rather that almost with any view I share, I care more about whether that view is a helpful contribution to the way you're trying to look about in the world, make sense of the world or not. That's more important to me than whether I'm giving you the right analysis. Um, and I care enormously about trying to give the right analysis, but I care even more about the procedural features of it rather than the sort of terminus features of it, which are always up to being questioned anyway, if we're talking about an ever changing world. So it's that one of the distinctive things that you get on my channels is this commitment to process, and commitment to trying to make a contribution to you via process rather than via a conclusion. Um, but conclusions matter too. And then the other way around, happiness for me in this conversation comes not from you sharing a conclusion with me, but from you feeling good about how you're going about finding your own conclusions, or for you feeling better in a way that's partly to do with interactions we've had. That's what's truly um, gratifying. It's not me selling you opinions, if you like, in exchange for your time. Grant is saying I'm still way out there, but I'm a bit more ruddered. Fantastic. Vitali is saying, hello, Vlad, greetings from Ukraine. Very grateful for your insight. How much of a danger is Ukraine's own democratic decline in this war? I see a lot of it, opacity of politics and distrust exacerbated. So Ukraine is in an extraordinarily difficult situation, but it's not a unique situation. Ukraine's an imperfect democracy, and Ukraine has had to suspend some of its democracy and some of its freedoms because it's at war. And it is a situation that has precedent and has pedigree, where democracies partly suspend democracy under emergency situations. That happens. That happens. And it's normal. The problem for Ukraine arises is the problem rising for Ukraine in part is, well, there are certain kinds of temporary suspensions of freedoms and democracy that are fine for a year or two, but what is the right balance for a conflict that lasts 4 or 7 years, right? And where this gets really, really painful and important is that Ukraine has to continue having a conversation with itself about where it's going. It's a very difficult conversation for Ukraine to have because it's in some ways left out on a limb, um, with very uncertain support from the West. Ukraine still has to have a picture of where it's going and have a conversation with itself about where it's going. Well, under conditions of war, it's very difficult to have such a conversation. Do I have any advice? Yes, very limited, because I draw some boundaries about how deeply I comment on Ukrainian politics. But one um, piece of advice I do have is that the longer the war goes on, the more dangerous it is to have a conception of national security that is broad. So you see, you can have a conception of national security that's to do with military threats, but you can also have a conception of security that has to do, for instance, with speech and freedom of expression. That, the question is, what constitutes an existential threat to the state at an extreme situation? And my advice is to narrow that conception and tolerate more pluralism domestically, um, rather than have a very far-reaching conception where you get Ukrainians calling each other threats to the country's security for having the wrong position or the wrong view. So this kind of um, partial suspension of freedoms and democracy that happens in extreme situations becomes more difficult if the extreme situation becomes prolonged and sustained. Um, and that kind of suspension projected over a long period of time can do damage, even when it won't do much damage over a year or two. So these are some of the Ukraine specific issues here, but then there are very broad global issues that Ukraine is also going to face around democracy, and that is that, imagine that Ukraine gets a relatively good outcome from the war. Well, Ukraine will still need to win the peace, and Ukraine will still need to win the peace under conditions of global democratic decline. Right? There's no country in the world that's sort of magically immune from democratic recession, and even Ukraine with a very good outcome from the war will still be vulnerable to this recession, and indeed more vulnerable because its institutions are much weaker than the institutions of Britain, let's say. So that's not an answer, but it's the beginning of two strands of a conversation, right? The global democratic recession, and then short-term versus long-term suspension of certain democratic processes and freedoms under conditions of crisis. But what I will say again, in my capacity as a political philosopher, is that the very act of such suspension under crisis, if it's temporary, is not bizarre. It's not an aberration. It's what other democracies would do too. Listrine is asking who will pay for Ukraine's rebuilding. Well, a lot of people will want to pay if Ukraine is safe and secure, and very few people will want to pay if Ukraine is insecure and at risk of uh, Russians coming back for a second go. Perun, who is one of the fantastic um, uh, brothers on the platform here that I have, Graham says, did a video today on Ukraine's economic survival, if I understand correctly. I haven't caught that. Economic sustenance, sorry, not economic survival. Dear Vlad, you said on Futurecast podcast, which is a highly recommended conversation about democratic decline that I had, Futurecast, that Kremlin genuinely thinks they're fighting a defensive war. How is that possible? Susanna is asking. Well, a few people in this space have heard me say it, so I'll be a little bit reheating old cabbage here. So this is how Putin thinks about this. Um, and there's quite a consensus here. So for example, there are experts who disagree with me about the nature of the Putin regime, who agree with me, nevertheless, that Putin is fighting an existential and defensive war. So imagine that Putin has a Belarus-like situation Belarus had in 2020. Imagine Putin has that in 2027. Putin's aware that he could have it. At a time of that happening, having a democratic and independent Ukraine on Russia's borders will be an existential threat to Russia, in Putin's mind, because he is Russian, his regime is Russia. So what kind of threat could it be? Well, it could be sufficient to make the difference between that wobbly moment for Putin's regime materializing in his overthrow or not. And overthrow for Putin is a situation without guarantees, right? It could be a threat to his physical survival. So Putin believes that an independent Ukraine, forget about joining Western alliances, just a democratic, independent Ukraine on Russia's borders, is a threat to his regime. Therefore, it's a threat to his physical security and a threat to his sense of Russia, because his sense of Russia is roughly him, right? There's this Wagnerian story that he has of the collective self-realization of a culture being expressed in the will of a single individual. So Putin doesn't just think that an independent Ukraine is a physical threat to his body. He's right about that, in my view. That analysis is correct. If Russia reaches a tipping point, an independent Ukraine on Russia's borders that is not got a compromised sovereignty, partly controlled by Moscow, that's going to be a threat to the regime at that point, and thereby a threat to Putin. That's a correct analysis. So he's right about that. Ukraine doesn't just in his conspiratorial mind pose a threat to him, it actually poses a threat to him. So we've got a real problem here. This is not something he can think his way out of. He's genuinely fighting a defensive war in his mind. He's fighting a defensive regime security war in good part. There are some other mystical escalatory elements to his sense of what this war is about. But this is about bodily security for Putin. And what's worse for us all, which is why Putin won't stop until he's stopped, is that he's right in his analysis that it's a physical threat to him. Grant is talking about Putin's phobias. Well, yeah, Putin's major phobia is that what happens to him is what happened to Gaddafi. That's his main phobia. What concerned Putin more, Ukraine joining NATO or Ukraine joining the EU? Ukraine joining NATO concerned him more. But you see, Putin doesn't recognize Ukraine's agency. And therefore, he thinks that an independent Ukraine, a Ukraine that doesn't want to comply with Moscow's whims, must be an example of gross US imperial intervention in Russia's near abroad that should be um, appropriately um, Russia's sphere of influence. So what I'm saying is that even without NATO or EU, just an independent Ukraine is for Putin inevitably something that he interprets as egregious projection of US power designed to weaken Russia. Yulia, your face very good, Paul. Yes. Russell is asking about potential, alliances and conflict between India and China and Saudi Arabia and Iran. There is a video on the main channel where I talked about us living in a world of enemies and allies in certain respects. So there are plenty of countries that can be enemies in certain dimensions, but ally in other dimensions with each other over particular economic interests, for instance. So we have this bizarre carousel of gray in how major global powers interact. And that's the nature of the global order, global disorder that we find ourselves in. Pool is asking whether I think Putin wants to be seen in the light of Peter the Great. So, sorry to plug stuff that I've done. There's a video on the main channel about Alexander III and Putin. And around 2015, by which time Putin had already developed his missionary turn, which began perhaps in the early 2010s, Putin became obsessed with Tsar Alex III, who was in power 1855 till the early 1880s, when his father Alex II was assassinated, a progressive Tsar with a constitution on his desk when he lost his life. Alex III was a terrible reactionary. But even in his spiritual alliance with Alexander III, Putin managed to insert so many falsehoods into his historical account of Alexander III that it's not funny. I mean, Putin is a spectacularly bad historian, but yes, he visualizes himself as an historically significant puppeteer in whose hands the fate of Russia's cultural self-realization rests to some extent. So to that extent, he does conceive of himself as having that kind of aura. So Adrian's asking me about Jeffrey Sachs. So Jeffrey's enormously powerful on certain key issues like the climate crisis. He's enormously knowledgeable around East European politics. But for me, he's really run out of gas on this issue and has got the wrong end of the analysis. Some of my views about this are articulated in the video how the Western left gets this conflict wrong. I think that video is about 6 months ago. What the Western left gets wrong about the war, I think it's called, where I discuss, I think, some of the things that, though they have very different views, but some of the things that Sachs and also Noam Chomsky have got wrong about this conflict. So I think that Jeffrey's really ran out of gas on this, and his analysis has deteriorated into something of very low quality, I'm afraid, in my judgment, relative to some of his other analyses historically. And I think this has got worse over the last few years, in my opinion. But my sort of initial thoughts on it are on in that video on the main channel. Stop Cummington is saying, I think Ukraine's winning. At the moment, Russia is losing a crazy number of tanks, vehicles, and artillery. Russia keeps most in open fields, visible down to the make by satellite, so the intel is good. So I think that one of the dangers is that we pick one particular um, avenue of success for one of the two sides and extrapolate it. It's very important to put everything into the pot and then see how it weighs up. Prismpire is saying we in the West have gone around toppling various regimes in the name of the Cold War and replacing them with dictatorships in some cases. And now they think that if the West can do it, we can do it too. Well, two side-by-side thoughts, really. The US empire is doing a very constructive intervention, in my view, in Ukraine. So the US empire is an empire that is capable of benign and malign action. The Russian empire is only capable of destructiveness today. That's a very big difference. And it doesn't have a project, even a bad project, to offer, it just offers violence. And a porridge of partly mystical, partly fascist, partly neoliberal ideology, about which I hope to make a really major video soon. But we have enormously shot ourselves in the foot by failing to abide by our own values and principles in the West. And if you were to have a conversation about a future global order, if that conversation doesn't get derailed by the objection, what global order are you talking about? There is going to be no global order. There's going to be a partly managed chaos. That's the best we can get. But if you were to try to frame new arrangements for a global order in which the West would play a central part, one of the tenets of such a story would have to be, hey guys, let's us in the West now be more consistent at acting in accordance with what we preach. That would be a very important feature to not delegitimize us globally, in particular when an urgent conflict crisis arises on which we are right and for which we need to invoke our legitimacy. But we need to have it in the bank a bit. We need to bank it. So that element would absolutely be part of a future global order conversation, if that conversation is viable at all. Subs and Sodas asking, would Putin have suffered a threat to his regime if he didn't invade Ukraine? Was it absolutely necessary to do for him to stay in power? Wow. Well, you might say that he is now under greater threat, given how badly his initial invasion went. How badly the full-scale invasion went initially, I mean. I would say that the big picture analysis Putin had was correct. That war was a necessary element of medium-term regime sustenance. One of the things that Putin was clear about, for instance, is that he had completely lost the younger generation. They were no longer convinced of the legitimacy of this regime. And Putin's idea now is to skip them and skip forward to the next youngest generation. Yeah, people who are kids now will grow up in a few years and then fascicize those kids so that they're not no longer at a kind of normative distance from the regime. So an act of foreign aggression was, one can very compellingly argue, a necessary part of regime sustenance for the Putin regime. The question arises, though, why this and now, and why this in this way? But I think that some kind of um, foreign escalation um, was necessary, which is why, for instance, a few years before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, my war, and there's a video with this from 4 years ago, I think, on the main channel, called Inside Putin's Mind, um, where I talk about being concerned about Putin invading the Baltics, which one could argue may have been a more rational thing for him to try than invading Ukraine, as long as he had tried it later, after more Le Pens and Trumps are in power in Western countries. So I think you can very strongly argue Putin got it wrong on the details. I'm sorry, I call it details. It's an extraordinary amount of um, despicable destruction of human life. But I think the big picture is correct in Putin's analysis. The regime needed war for regime security. Stops Camington is asking me about Jeffrey Sachs, and it's almost a psychological question. I'm not sure. I've never spoken to Jeffrey in person. So I can make some observations just listening to him. I mean, people in my life have spoken to him. Do I think Jeffrey Sachs is being unreasonable about this conflict due to guilt, as he feels his reforms hurt Russia and its people? No. He thinks that it's because his suggestions were not followed about how the West should assist and support Russia in the early 90s, that Russia ended up in the kind of mess it ended up in. So his own analysis is that they didn't listen to me. So I don't think he feels guilt about that. I think he feels vindication. Whether he's right about that is a separate question, but he definitely feels vindication about his role. Scott Ritter, and how true is this? Pavel is asking. I would say it's unlikely to be true if Scott Ritter thinks it. Scott Ritter argues that Russia isn't responding to NATO's long-range weapons to avoid scaring countries away from the BRICS summit in Kazan, which could shift the global power balance. I'm not sure, Pavel, I entirely understand your question. I'm sorry. Um, I'm not sure what you are saying that Ritter is saying. He's saying that Russia would be responding in some way, what way, but isn't, because it is contingently not interested in escalation now. Sorry, I'm a bit lost. Sorry, Pavel, my bad. My bad. I mean, in terms of, the problem is I never listen to Ritter for more than 2 minutes. I just see clips circulating. So I don't know what he thinks, to be honest. What I've heard, I'm not compelled by, to say the least. But Putin is able to consider some responses, right, to the measure of further disinhibition by the West of Ukraine's use of its weapons. what are these responses that Putin could consider? They could be um, around backing actors, malign actors around the world. There could be hybrid war measures. So if we're talking about Putin's responses, we're talking in that sort of dimension. In terms of doing things to Ukraine, Russia is already doing more or less what it can do. There are some qualifiers to that, but I think that um, if we're talking about reciprocal escalation from the Russians, that would probably be the dimension. Hybrid war, malign global actors. Praise for Adam Curtis is often praise for Adam Curtis's documentaries in this community. And so kind of you to ask me about retiring. I am sort of a bit on another planet, but I'm delighted that I was able to join everybody, and we'll run for an hour and a half, so 20 more minutes. I don't think, Amorikat, I don't think Putin and Assad are close on a personal level. Um, I don't know who Putin is close to on a personal level in terms of global leaders. There are a lot of people he knows very well. Possibly the best case is Lukashenko, but Lukashenko and Putin despise each other. There's always things we can learn retrospectively, but I have no reason to think that Putin has a remotely close relationship with Assad. Somebody's saying I should have put China in the answer to my question of who is winning the war. I think that's a good comment. Subs and Soda, who is Putin close to then? Is Putin close to anybody outside of his family? Does he consider everyone a potential enemy? So a recent investigation came out about Putin's sons. So Putin has daughters from the first marriage. The investigation made some claims about Putin's sons from his next relationship. And a lot of experts, in fact, the majority of experts, came out and sort of poo-pooed that investigation. Well, so what if he has sons? That's uninteresting. And Greg Uden came out and said, you know what? It is interesting because there is a chance that this story moves toward hereditary monarchy. And if there is such a chance, this story matters. And I would agree. In other words, if there is more than a 1% chance that Russia moves toward the hereditary monarchy, then this is not just gossip, but it's actually fair political game and constructive information. Putin has this weird regime where people have designated levels of importance more than they have particular roles. And his circle constricted a lot around the pandemic period. And you could sense it even in the expert community, who often were able to say, oh, I could ask someone who could ask someone who could then ask someone who could give me some sense of what the hell is going on with Putin, and they lost that link. So his circle contracted very, very much. So we're talking about a very narrow um, group of people. Some of these people you see on the screen in Putin's Security Council. Um, Others you don't. Well, one of them has actually jumped into the Security Council recently. Um, but the Kovalchuk brothers are a good example of people who are close to Putin and in some ways ideologically close to Putin too, who have a significant influence, I think, over his thought, um, and are part of a very, very small inner circle. Somebody who you see a lot, who is nowhere near being part of any kind of circle of Putin's, is Medvedev. Jason is saying hello from New Jersey. Oh, no. Hello from Brazil. Now I'm going to fix my spectacles. You've never caught me live before. Nice to have you in my live. Peter's saying, how can we best help change the conclusion of this conflict? Western support for Ukraine makes a difference, and its sustenance makes a difference. And then what will further make a difference are Western security guarantees. So if you're into supporting Ukraine, do you live in a Western country that has significant influence over this or not? And then whatever influence it has politically as a citizen of your country, you vote or act so as to maximize the chances of uh, sustained support and then a public conversation about security guarantees for Ukraine. Sustenance of support, and then who's going to guarantee Ukraine security are two absolutely key issues. And a third issue, could we get a bit more strategic than we are currently being? And that's hard. But I mean, if you're in the United States, you potentially have the biggest say over this, but also in a way not, because it's just going to be a very small number of people in a very small number of states who are going to be deciding the next presidential election. Paul is saying that Putin's wife was in Albuquerque during the Trump administration. Um, Putin separated from his wife many, many years ago. The speculation is that he has a different partner now, and you can easily discover who that is. Presumably that's who you're talking about. Morty, you're asking a big question about the normative underpinnings of the electoral college in the US. We might talk about it when we talk about the election a bit more. Jason is saying, I have too many intelligent friends who have no interest in the plight of Ukraine and the US. I think it's generally the case that outside of the Scandinavian countries and outside of a few East European countries, support for Ukraine is big, but not deep. So in Britain, we have very strong support for Ukraine. in the sense of how many people take a broadly favorable view of Ukraine in this conflict. But the conflict itself is issue number 7 or 11 in the political discourse. I suppose I would add to my answer, Peter Marks, to your question is also don't do anything unconstructive, right? Don't become one of those people who are online battling with other people over minor differences, right? So don't go around calling other allies of Ukraine fake allies unless there's really good reason to call that. There's a lot of toxic infighting in the pro-Ukraine internet, and partly it's inevitable. It's part of the algorithmization, gamification of war. Partly it's a product of the fact that things aren't going as well as they should. People are talking about Jake Bro's massive fundraising. I think Jake has done a phenomenal job there. For ethical reasons, I can't even recommend you to um, directly support Ukraine because I want you to make that decision. Because as my position as an analyst, um, I cannot identify with either side in this conflict. I can express very strong views about which side is right, and express strong views about what Western governments should do. But the power of my, if you like, analytically pro-Ukrainian position precisely lies in the fact that I'm not in any way a pro-Ukraine activist. You see, in other words, the fact that I can wake up tomorrow and say, okay, on balance, supporting Ukraine now destabilizes Western democracies too much, and we should stop. The fact that I have that capacity to do that um, gives strength to any pro-Ukrainian analysis that I give. Actually, so that's very important for me to retain that independence. But yes, I was hugely stoked for how well that went for Jake. Susanna, you're asking me for a really important and difficult question. Could I make a more detailed case for how to defeat the Kremlin? I mean, if the West had resplendently stable democracies, it's not a massively outlandish claim to say that at least it's worth talking about whether or not it could have chased the Putin regime out of power in the first 18 months of the war. But that is not continuous with Western capacities, right? So I go as far as saying that the West is incapable of developing a strategically serious response to this conflict. As long as you work within this delimited paradigm, then you can get a little bit more strategic seriousness from the West, but not much more. So the conversation therefore ends up being just a series of piecemeal steps to further support Ukraine. What I would say is that the arguments that best compel support for Ukraine politically are no longer moral, the way they were, or humanitarian, the way they were in the first year of the war. The best arguments are now all about the national interest of the major Western powers. Rachel is saying, will you discuss the Russia at War film that was controversial in Canada? So I can't because I'm not going to see it probably. But I have some general views about this issue. I think I shared a little bit on Twitter. And I did watch one film embedded with the Russian forces, um, called The Other Side or something like that. And that was done, um, um, with a guy who is a wily war correspondent. Here is the problem. There's a kind of a structural problem there. The people most likely to want to embed themselves with the Russian army are people who are very tough, very gritty war correspondents. But they're not likely to be the people who can take a big picture of the war and give a political analysis. And so, what was a flaw in that film, even though it was filmically good, just like a lot of the films that are celebrated, on the, you know, telling Ukraine stories. Some of them are good, some of them are not good. In other words, you can be on the right side politically but make a bad film. That film was filmically quite good, but it was deeply flawed because it had to give a political big picture of what was happening, and it failed to engage with that. It just presented it as an army fighting another army largely, and that's not what's happening. So, insofar as that was absent, that was a problem. And I think it's a structural problem that the vast majority of embedded with the Russian army films are going to run into. So, I would naturally expect such a film to fail. Having said this, I don't think that's a principled problem. In other words, you can, in principle, embed with the Russian army and make a good film. It would just need to be a film that doesn't mince its lines about the fact that the Russians are the bad side here. Can you do that? I think in principle you can. It would require access plus complete editorial freedom plus a capacity not just to do what war correspondent work, but to give a big picture political analysis, right? And then that's going to be really difficult to do in practice, but normatively it's impeccable. I mean, is it in principle ethical for a journalist to embed themselves with the German army in the early 40s? Yeah, it is. It's just very difficult to imagine how that works in practice. But in principle, it's impeccable as long as the German army comes out looking like they're engaged in a radically evil project, then that's fine. So that's what I would say. But then, of course, that's just one key ingredient. There are other filmic ingredients that are important. For instance, I thought that Mariupol, that X number of days in Mariupol, was an extraordinarily important document, but it had lots of very big, major filmic weaknesses that never got discussed because people just took it in a politically correct way and took it as an important document. But the trouble is, you can't just make a filmically good film without that political big picture. And embedding yourself with the Russian army is going to go really badly for the objectivity of your film unless you sort of push things through that needle that I'm describing. Meg, I'm so sorry that your family is sick right now. My gentle, healthful wishes. Richard is asking me, Vlad, has your view of Kamala's victory changed at all in the last couple of weeks? I personally think she's heading for a landslide win. So I think that it's now a situation that I would hedge as close, but in Trump's favor still. The trouble is, however, for Trump, that he is losing 20 days in Mariupol, yes. The trouble is for Trump is that Trump is flailing. And if he continues to flail and misfire all the way through till November, and Kamala continues to do well, she may well win. She may well win. I would say it's closer than the 70-30 I was giving it a few weeks ago, but I would still edge it in Trump's favor as we stand. So a lot of people are at very big risk of very bitter, existential, disorienting disappointment in this community, because I know the majority of you probably think that Kamala is heading for a win. And I really think it's closer to 50-50 than it has been. But I'd subtly give Trump the edge. But then you could argue that she is gaining on him and he's falling behind. I think if Trump stopped making significant mistakes between now and November, he'll probably win. I think that's one of the major factors. But understand how difficult this is. Kamala needs to perform consistently and exceptionally. I mean, we're dealing with very authoritarian populist waters here electorally. So things are very much in Trump's favor. So for Kamala to win, she needs to be consistent and exceptional, and Trump needs to flail and make mistakes. A lot of that is happening as we speak. So you could make a strong case for Kamala, but I would still subtly put Trump as favorite at the moment. But on the condition that he continues making mistakes and Kamala continues to perform really well, she will win. So I think that's where we are. And I'm sorry that I'm saying this. I wish I wasn't saying it, because while I don't think that Trump's likely to ruin American democracy, I think he's likely to do some very serious, lasting institutional damage and civic damage, as well as being catastrophic on a range of policies from climate to Ukraine. So I'd put Trump subtly ahead, but he's doing a lot to lose as we stand. Prison Pie is saying you're wrong. Well, that's the point. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying, because 63.4% of people here think Kamala's heading for a victory, like you thought that Hillary was headed for a victory in 2016. One cruel. Yeah, you're quite right. It doesn't matter what the disagreement is. The point is Kamala needs to perform consistently and at the highest level. So this is really bloody tough for her. It's a very uneven race in the sense of how much excellence is required from her relative to Trump. A competent person in Trump's place, like Viktor Orban, just wins, no matter what Kamala Harris does, just wins, no contest. So we are lucky that we're dealing with an erratic buffoon with a lot of communicative genius, but also tremendous lack of discipline. And that may well allow Kamala Harris to win. But I'm sort of 55, 45, 60, 40 toward Trump at the moment. I'm really sorry about that. And yes, you're saying that I'm wrong, but the whole point is that's why I'm saying it, so you can say back that I'm wrong. I wouldn't say this if I thought that the community didn't need an invitation into a nudge. I have promised to talk about Alan Lichtman's oh my God, I've lost the word. Please tell me what's the word that I'm looking for? It's not his criteria. It's keys. Yeah, the keys to the White House. Thank you. 13 keys to the White House. So I want to talk about that because I really see that, and I don't want to legislate on it now, but I really see that as a set of quite well-placed considerations that are explanatorily gripping, compelling in a certain historical phase, but I fear we're out of that phase, which is why he was convinced that Biden would win if he stayed, whereas I think Biden was heading for a near certain defeat against Trump. So I think the 13 keys are not a theory of society. They are a set of piecemeal shorthands for a phase of recent American history that has ended. But I want to explain a little bit more about that. So, but that's just my nutshell opinion about why this constellation seemed to work, but doesn't anymore. Plus, of course, there's a conversation about how much vacuity there is in some of these keys, right? You have to fill them out, and a lot of them are enormously up to interpretation. And you could say that a key has um, the conditions in the key have been met or they haven't been met, and you could dispute that. Like, what's a foreign policy crisis and so on? What's social unrest? Um, I mean, one of the things that's positive at the moment is that some of the polls are incorporating an understanding that previously polls used to underestimate Trump. So that's a positive thing to say about the polls at the moment. Sometimes I'm asked, Vlad, you're an analyst. Why on earth are you so disgracefully biased and you're so clearly in a black and white way supporting one side? You're not supporting, but preferring one side here. And unashamedly, my answer is that any time there is anti-constitutional, anti-institutional, anti-democratic politics, I'm going to disfavor it, and it's my responsibility to disfavor it. So I'm sorry, I don't buy the point that I'm unfair to Trump. Let's take one last question from Peter again. What are your thoughts that there's a broader war against the West through social programming, through social media platforms like TikTok, creating masses being dissociated from society? So um, I spend more time talking about Russian disinformation because I have, even though I'm not a country expert as such, I have a lot of context with that country, and it's responsible for me as a political philosopher to comment on it. I spend less time talking about China for obvious reasons. I want to pass on the baton to people who have deeper Chinese context than I do. What I would say with all such questions is that the answer is going to be invariably yes. We should be worried in this direction, but we should not conflate, beyond a certain point, organic political forces in our society with malign foreign interference. So I think that's really, really important. As long as we understand that, we can then go on and also acknowledge the ways the Russians and the Chinese are trying to interfere in our societies. What I would say is that the vast preponderance of the materials of our decline and our alienation and our depoliticization, our dissociation, use your word, overwhelmingly all of that is local, and then to a small degree it is a product of malign foreign interference. That's how I'd begin the weighing presumptively in this conversation, and the conversation can go on and look at particular things. I mean, you could say that with particular events, particular elections, particular moments of political moment, you could weigh that balance differently, but almost always it's going to be a case of local stuff being the chief explanatory story. Because one of the things we really don't want to do is call Trump voters sort of roboticized, um, inadvertent roboticized actors for foreign states. So I am going to give myself 2.39 out of 10 for this live, but I'm very grateful for all of you being with me. I did my best, and it's a great pleasure. And I hope to be with you soon. Whenever a next main channel video comes, it'll probably be a video about this recent ongoing conversation about Putin's red lines and how to conceptualize that. Pedro, just very briefly, you're asking me why aren't we more invested in Ukrainian victory? We're not more invested in Ukraine's victory for many reasons, but the chief one being our democratic incapacity at home. We don't have the democratic capacity to develop a strategy for that region in relation to this conflict. Grant 9.2 is too generous. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Lots of love, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.